Thank you guys for joining us. Let's give it 1 more minute for people to log in. All right, let's get started. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning. Happy Lunar New Year. Welcome to the USC EASC New Book Series for Sinophone Studies. My name is Li-Ping Chen. I'm the Postdoctoral Scholar and Teaching Fellow in the East Asian Studies here at USC. I hope everyone is taking good care and staying safe during these challenging times. So today is our first event in this monthly series. This monthly series introduces recent publications about Sinophone studies, and our theme for spring 2022 is border crossing. Today, we will discuss how contemporary China circulate in transnational discourse. In March, we will talk about transnational Hong Kong style stunt work and performance. In April, we will look at defectors from the PRC to Taiwan. You can find more information on our event webpage, and I will also share the link later in the chat box. I want to thank Sonia and Grace for their great support for this series, and also Alex and Caitlin for their help. I also want to thank our co-sponsor, the Society of Sinophone Studies. Today, we are very delighted to have Professor Hentyle Yapp here with us to talk about his new book, Minor China, Method, Materialisms, and Aesthetic. This book was published by Duke University Press in 2021. He is Associate Professor of Performance Studies in the Department of Theater and Dance at UCSD. His research engages the theoretical and methodological implications of queer, feminist, disability, and critical race studies for questions about the state and the transnational. Hentyle is also the co-editor of Saturation, Race, Art, and the Circulation of Value. This is a book about race and the art world. His essays have appeared in American Quarterly, GLQ, Verge, and many other journals. In addition to his academic work, Hentyle is also an artist and a dancer. Our discussant today is Professor Kandice Chuh. She is Professor of English, American Studies, and Critical Social Psychology at the City University of New York Graduate Center. Her current research focuses on Asian racialization in the era of globalization. She teaches courses on aesthetic theory, and queer of color critique, decolonial studies, and Asian American racialization. She is the author of The Difference Aesthetic Makes on the Humanities After Man, and also Imagine Otherwise on Asian Americanist critique. Kandice is also the co-editor of Orientations, Mapping Studies in the Asian Diaspora. She has published in many journals such as Public Culture, American Literary History, and the Journal of Asian American Studies, just to name a few. Before I hand the time to Hentyle, I want to speak a little bit about the structure for our event today. We will begin with the author's presentation and continue with discuss and comment. After that, we will move on to the Q&A section. At any points during the talk, feel free to share your questions, your thoughts, and feedback in the Q&A box. And if possible, please include information about your affiliation. The Q&A box is located in your Zoom control panel. There, you will also find the closed caption function. please note the live transcript is automatically generated by Zoom. So that's all I have to say. And now I will turn it over to Hentyle.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Li-Ping, and also the USC's EASC Asian Studies Center for this really kind invitation, along with all the behind-scenes labor with Grace, Alex, Caitlin, and many others. I also want to thank Kandice, Professor Chu, for engaging my work in this way. I have been a long-standing fan of your work, so I truly feel so honored and humbled that you take the time for this discussion. It's also a pleasure to be here today with all of you, and I'm excited to sort of walk through the book a bit. So what I'll do today is give a general introduction to the book and then read briefs part from the introduction, and afterward, I'll work through the larger stakes of the book. After this, if there's some time, I might sort of walk through some of the archive of the book, just to give you a sense of some of the artists and objects that I focused on. And throughout, please feel free to add any questions if anything pops in your mind, and we'll try to address those at the end. Beyond questions, I'm also just curious about reactions and relations of this book to your own work, so please don't place pressure on yourselves to come up with fully articulated questions per se. Happy to think alongside you. Minor China, Method, Materialisms, and the Aesthetic develops an archive that focuses on contemporary Chinese art. But by doing so, the book is less of a proper art history and more about the structures that frame our very understanding of the art itself. Why is it that the primary way this art is discussed is always through a liberal romance narrative, whereby the resistant artist challenges the authoritarian Chinese state? I examine why and how Western liberalism creates a major narrative of China, and why I turn to the minor and Marxism help us rethink this condition. This book is less about developing methods for theorizing and engaging non-Western and more broadly minoritarian art that do not only obtain value through a resistance narrative. I thus propose that we focus on things we might deem minor, from emphases on aspects that are often discounted due to an over-reliance on language or text over relations or emotions, so known as the affective turn, visual economies over other senses, things like the sonic, oral, haptic, and olfactory, anthropocentric accounts over objects and things, so drawing from things like new materialisms and object-oriented ontology, and demands for realistic practical solutions over less determined meanings, so things like drawing from speculative realism. Each of these terms have their respective genealogies, yet they place these multiple theoretical registers under the rubric of the minor to develop what I call the minor as method. This method draws from the above, and it also pushes us to think about the minor beyond solely a subject identity or peripheral geographic space. In this way, the minor becomes less about established ideas around minor subjects and objects that are seeking to be recognized and included, a la liberalism. And instead, the minor becomes a method for reconfiguring our political and aesthetic paradigms, institutions, and structures akin to what Kandice Chuh calls for as illiberal humanisms. In other words, I offer the minor as method as a way to track and highlight the predetermined ideas, ontological conditions, and epistemological foundations that entrap China in the major. So let me perhaps turn to a concrete example that I develop in the introduction. Ai Weiwei, let me pull this up. Ai Weiwei is representative of the ways the non-Western artists and nation have become tethered to expected major narratives, circumscribed by a set of key terms: history, the state, subject, and agency. For example, when considering Ai's dropping a Han Dynasty urn, critics often first emphasize Ai's allusion to China's long history through his destruction of a Han Dynasty urn. They then focus on his relation to the state and critiques of China's pre-modern ways, emphasizing a legible mode of agentic resistance. Following the 2014 scandal that erupted when fellow artist Maximo Caminero smashed one of the urns that Ai painted for Miami's Perez Museum, many journalists foreseeably discussed these urns as representing the modern world's alienation and situated the work in relation to the Cultural Revolution. Further, since I spent time in New York during the 1980s and 90s, many critics have attributed what they perceive as his critique of the Chinese state to Ai having tasted the possibilities of Western liberal democracy. In accounts from the New York Times to The Guardian, authors repeatedly stress Ai's exposure to the West as seminal to his approach. However, beyond such narratives that exceptionalize Western liberalism as the paradigm for political action, there are other ways of reading I's work that exceed these normative liberal theorizations. If one focuses less on the sensationalized destruction of the urn and more on the affect of boredom in I's face, it is possible to begin to unpack a different relation to history and agency. In particular, I does not signal an intense anger or an astonished surprise at the dropping of the urn, an expression which might be more expected when performing a liberal ideal of resistance against the state. Instead, I's face remains calm and bored throughout the triptych. This minor detail helps us hesitate from the normative ways I is understood. I's boredom, in other words, operates as a mechanism to engage other readings. Instead of resistance, I performs fatigue with the proper narrative prescribed to his work. I additionally plays with the form of the triptych and the medium of photography to amplify this exhaustion with routinized approaches to his art. Although the triptych captures the temporal development from I holding the urn to its final destruction, it also depicts I's sustained boredom alongside his intention to destroy the object. He purposely drops the urn as the triptych captures his hands that remain at the same level above his shoulders. His corporeal position illustrates how he remains frozen in time, while the photos capture a developmental sequence. In other words, I plays with the temporality associated with the triptych form, pointing to the way non-Western subjects remain stuck in time while ideas of progress move along. These notions of progress are not only about civilizational development, but also the avant-garde. The ready-made is often understood as progressive experimentation for whiteness and regressive derivative reperformance for minoritarian subjects. The method of minor China that I develop in this book furthers the approach briefly demonstrated above. The minor, however, does not refer to its usual definition surrounding small or unimportant objects, or even minority subjects and spaces. I direct the term minor towards minoritarian ends, as my aim is not to flatten the category to include any body or object that has not been folded into recognition. Rather, a commitment to minoritarian ends requires that we track analyses toward the larger goal of re-envisioning our habits and protocols in ways that resonate with historical remediation and a Marxist notion of social structuration. In particular, this book focuses on Marxism to not only provide an attunement of minor methods to political economy, but also name an explicit project that moves us beyond critiques of liberalism. For example, in chapter 2, I return to Ai Weiwei and trace how his aesthetics offer a way to track understandings of the subject that do not default into the liberal strongholds of individual representation and inclusion. Instead, I explore how his uses of repetition with aesthetics objects and racialized subjects, so for those perceived as all looking the same, all look same as a kind of racialized condition, help produce what Petrus Leo calls for as, quote, a theory that is capable of understanding the human as the subject of political action as well as an effect of social structuration, end quote. So in this way, my book is focused less on subject formation and agency and more on social structuration. So to push minoritarian discourse to focus less on the subject and more on the structures they maintain our very limited understandings of subjects themselves. So I hope you see the kind of synergy and a lot of what I draw from Kandice Chuh's work, particularly in terms of subjectless critique here. So throughout this book, I highlight social structuration to bring to the fore the imbalanced historical conditions and theoretical assumptions that predetermine established terms like history, the state, subject agency, and even the aesthetic. These terms are presumed knowable across not only Eurocentric, but also minoritarian discourses and fields, especially when they demonstrate the merits of including non-Western spaces, racialized others, and cultural production as the means to expand human knowledge. Put more explicitly, the entrenched argument that non-Western art is worthy of inclusion and valuable for demonstrating resistant agency against the strong state repeats static formulations of subjects, culture, and the state, and reinforces the logics of liberalism, modern humanism, and capitalism. The minor as method thus hesitates from furthering these logics and attends to the nuanced and vibrant intricacies of minor aesthetics, subjects, spaces, and histories as methods to restructure. And even so, why engage minorly? Political stakes of this minor method circulate around materialist concerns that grapple with Cold War legacies, global racialization, the idea of a global left, relational and solidarity politics, and late liberalism. Rather than reify how we conceptualize these structural issues, I turn to the grain of sense. I draw from an admittedly unwieldy archive of the minor, from senses, affects, objects, and things to those minor subjects who have existed as senses, affects, objects, and things. I do so to examine what insights they provide for a hesitant minor method. Focusing on the level of sense responds to the exhaustion many minoritarian thinkers experience with most approaches to the social and political. For those theorizing and often enduring forms of major structural violence, there are limits surrounding disciplinary formations, liberal approaches, and dominant Marxist accounts of revolution. A rethinking is needed, one that comes less from major political concerns and counterintuitively more from the fact that the minor begs to be sensed differently in order to help us imagine other analytic modes for materialist concerns. And rather than rely on a developmental logic to label these concerns as newer materialisms, the focus on sense and minor things expands our methodological approaches to contend with ongoing old Marxist issues. This book, therefore, privileges, without glorifying affect and the aesthetic, to renegotiate our ideas around the state and its subjects, to read and sense major forms affectively. Affect, a key analytic for this book, refers to not only emotion, but also the relations across objects, subjects, and environment. The payoff of these approaches is that they move us away from ethnographic and static notions of difference and liberalist politics surrounding inclusion. Subjects, the state, and objects are in turn reimagined through the minor. Minor China as method thus refuses to replicate the major assumptions beyond the key terms that situate the non-West, produce better readings of art for China, or privilege new terms over established ones. The remainder of the book's introduction unpacks the minor as it reevaluates the nation state and the global. So I'll just sort of give you a sense of some of the sections in the introduction. So if first sort of look at the idea of the nation state and the global alongside the notion of method. So that's both sections 1 and 2. After I examine how these minor approaches grapple with the place of China within critical theory so as to engage the nation state affectively. So to look at the history of China within critical theory and then what it means to speculate or to think about China in theory. I then highlight the aesthetic and its entwinement with mediation as a key method for this book, arguing for a renewed theory of the aesthetic that reconsiders its relation to the political in ways that are not dictated by liberal representationalism. The introduction lastly illuminates the book's contributions to interdisciplinarity, thinking with and through the import of thinking about China and the global in minor ways as it relates to two particular schools of thought, the first being Francophone metaphysical thought from thinkers like Edouard Glissant, Fanon, Deleuze, and Guattari, which has been so critical to various minor turns, and two, Black feminist theory from figures like Saidiya Hartman and Hortense Spillers, in addition to Caribbean theorist Sylvia Wynter, which has been so critical for expanding our very understanding of the minor beyond the subject. So I'll read now from the afterword just to give you a sense of some of the larger stakes of the book in terms of how I close. And then if there's a little bit of time, then I can kind of go through some of the archive of the book. I write this afterword during the summer of 2019 as I watch multiple months of protest against China's intensified presence in Hong Kong. The protests initially rose as a response against the Hong Kong's government's capitulation to Beijing's request for extradition. These protests have since sought to highlight a range of issues: rising housing costs due to an influx of money from China, election practices, police brutality, sovereignty from the Chinese Communist Party, and state censorship. Although this book is meant to think about the longue durée of history, I turn to this immediate moment to contend with the idea that China is, in fact, major. Whenever I would present material from this book, especially to audiences working primarily with Asian studies, one comment to retort would be, but China is major, why make it minor? What is implied by those arguing that China is in fact major is an investment in possibility. It is an investment in response, protest, and dissent to change the immediate material conditions of the day. These concerns inform how we approach Taiwan sovereignty, the ongoing silencing encampment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, the oppression in Tibet, gender and sexual discrimination, and the complicated history surrounding colonialism for Hong Kong. In this vein, Hong Kong's 2019 protests illustrate the hope for and investment in possibility. And under liberal logics, this idea of possibility often demonstrates a desire to hear the voice of the people, those minor within and to China, and for them to be represented. I find myself following these events out of a sense of hope, but is less as a form of liberal optimism. Within a short span of time, the 2014 Umbrella Movement in Hong Kong, 2014 Sunflower Student Movement in Taiwan, 2018 Yellow Vest Movement in France, and the Red for Public Education strikes in the United States starting in 2018 provide an immediate history that informs Hong Kong's 2019 actions. These collective moments renew a sense of possibility that many have dismissed following the 1960s. However, I struggle with ways to express these sentiments beyond the legible discourse of liberal free speech and rights. My hope arises from a commitment to socialism and is fueled by critiques of US empire and its deep entwinement with capitalist modernity. Yet, the language to express this hope is often eclipsed and consumed by liberalism, whereby the US becomes the tacit benchmark for the idea of political progress. But in fact, the US rampantly practices and supports censorship, anti-Blackness, authoritarianism, genocide, misogyny, femicide, violence against populations across the globe, state-sponsored torture, territorial occupation, settler colonialism, capitalist extraction, environmental abuse, and corporate greed, among many other violations the US accuses other nations of enacting. Even as the events in Hong Kong unfold, I am struck by the discursive and theoretical limits by which to understand forms of critique against Major China that do not default into liberalist sentiments. Liberalism informs not only Western media's descriptions of the protests in Hong Kong, but also the activism itself. I find that others seeking to launch critique of a non-Western state are often delimited by liberalism, whereby critique of dictatorship, authoritarianism, or suppression is often only legible as demands for individual rights and freedom. This ultimately obscures the historic and ongoing roles of capitalism and Western imperialism in producing the very conditions that affect the lives of those in the non-West. Thus, I end this book by focusing on how the method of the minor brings to the fore the ways liberalism normatively informs and limits the notion of critique. Those minor to and within China experienced Major China in immediate ways. Even though this book has focused on China in the global and in relation to the West, the nation state still exists as an imperial force. Thus, how do we begin to discuss this without defaulting into Western democracy and liberalism as the norms that define speech, challenge, and rights? How might a global Marxist legacy help us hold China accountable, rather than relying on capitalist modernity as the model for how the state functions with regard to the individual? The method of minor China brings to the fore how liberalism predetermines critiques of the non-West. What might happen if we sought to free the notion of speech from the limits of free speech? Is there a Marxist theory of speech? Although some have examined the ways Marx discusses speech in the press within political theory, I consider the aesthetic as providing critical minor approaches to these questions. I won't read the part in the book, but I do turn to an aesthetic object by the Hong Kong-based artist Samson Young, who does really great sound work to sort of walk through these questions, but I'll kind of give you a sense of the larger framework. I asked the above because I am one of those minor to China. My parents are from Taiwan, and I've always been taught that China is major. My parents did not arrive to Taiwan with the Kuomintang, the KMT. They became the ruling class after their loss to the Communist Party. My parents' families were among those silenced during the White Terror, whose lands, languages, and already limited resources were stripped with the rise of another colonial power following Japan's colonization. Due to this history, my parents have incessantly focused on how major China is, in its historic articulation through the KMT, and also its contemporary presence through the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. I hail this personal history because while finishing this book, my father passed away. And while watching the protests in Hong Kong, I've also been parsing through what I have inherited from my father. He was quite active in the Taiwan independence movement. And after fleeing political persecution in Taiwan from the KMT, he came to the United States. Thus, why would I seek to render China minor when my own familial history and the contemporary moment have continually emphasized China's majorness? I do so in order to better understand how liberalism and capitalist modernity limit the very language and ideas for how we imagine and enact social and political change. Beyond my own personal history, these dynamics have come to be mirrored through the populations that are minor to China. They have often increased their identification with the local. Hong Kongers and Taiwanese have asserted more and more their difference from mainland Chinese, particularly following the opening of borders and increased tourism across these regions. These modes of identification come to parallel the logic inherent in the nation's one China, two systems policy, whereby one can be part of China, but also have its own separate identity. Those spaces minor to, yet also part of major China. This policy, of course, is now at the crux of the ongoing protests as China is forced to reckon with this stated ideal and to grapple with if or when autocracy becomes authoritarianism. And obviously this is something that since I wrote this in 2019 and a lot has been happening, this was sort of a moment of that possibility or hope that I was thinking about around the line between, in the US, we often equate autocracy, authoritarianism, but there was a kind of moment of hope to actually think and parse those two apart. And I still think that's a helpful and important exercise to do for thinking through different models of governance and illiberal humanisms and liberal existence. Regardless, some forms of these local identities for Hong Kong and Taiwan are rooted in xenophobia that perpetuates the racist notion of the Chinese as less civilized than their other counterparts. These types of logics are constantly infused with the sense of advanced racialized development, particularly through a presumed proximity to capitalist modernity. It seems quite difficult then to articulate a critique of China without defaulting into racialist discourse alongside liberalism as the tacit ideal. This is a condition that shapes many who are critical of, yet work from, what M. Jackie Alexander astutely calls the seat of empire. It is hard for me to pronounce a critique of China without it taking on an anti-Marxist bent that seemingly emerges from liberalism. To be clear, I'm as critical of US empire and capitalism as I am of China's relationship to late capital and suppression of those within and outside of China. However, I find it near impossible to express these simultaneous forms of critique due to the epistemological foundation surrounding critique itself. One can further trace these limits in the media coverage of the Hong Kong activists. And watching the coverage of the protests from the vantage of the US, I've been struck by the ways this movement is only legible through major China and the frameworks of resistance and liberal free speech. Notably, the bipartisan support within the US of the protesters during an era of rampant partisanship in Congress further illustrates the limited narratives in which the 2019 protests register. There seems to be little discourse available by which to imagine speech beyond the bounds of free speech. Socialist legacies could provide such models, although at this point less developed. Further, the specters of Stalinism and communism often thwart the ability to imagine a Marxist sensibility surrounding speech. Thus, I've privileged the aesthetic throughout this book due to the fact that it opens up space beyond political and theoretical discourses that often limit how we imagine what politics and theory are or can be. This is not to privilege the aesthetic as the answer or place of otherwiseness. Rather, the aesthetic is both part of the problem of critique and a necessary component to rethink these apparatuses. The aesthetic, when understood in relation to Hong Kong and Taiwan's precarious relations to China, offers a method to render China minor, even though it appears to be quite major. The remainder of this afterword thus grapples with these concerns to the aesthetic in order to rethink this condition surrounding critique, liberalism, and speech. In this vein, minor China is a method for not only China in the Western imaginary, but also China throughout the Asia-Pacific region. So that gives you hopefully a sense of kind of the broader stakes of the book. I just thought it might be helpful for those, since I assume many people who haven't read it, are just sort of some of the archive of the work. So the first chapter is that we're going to party like it's 1989. I'm a huge fan of Prince, but this is really trying to historicize the global art market, and especially in terms of China's entrance into it. And where I'm not just thinking about the global art market, but also interdisciplinarity, aesthetics, politics, discourse. It's an unwieldy chapter, I think, but I was very excited to write it. So I give a kind of general history of some of the artists and then really focus on Sai Guoqiang's Venice's Rent Collection Courtyard. The second chapter is titled All Look Same. So this is where I look at Ai Weiwei's work, where I develop concepts related to the multitude, comrade aesthetics, and racial anger in a time of global inclusion. So I look at his piece Fairy Tale, where he brought 1,001 objects, statues and chairs and such, and then also 1,001 Chinese people throughout the entire run of Documenta. And then, so chapter 1 and 2 are in many ways where I'm really trying to think about inclusion based in relation to the global art market and some of its logics, and then do a kind of closer read to an aesthetic read around Ai Weiwei and the inclusion of Chinese artists into the global art market. Chapter 3 and 4 is really where I kind of put pressure on those 4 components that I was talking about earlier around history, the state, subject, and agency. So chapter 3 is looking particularly at history and the state, where I look at Yin Xing's Kill the TV Set, and then a set of curatorial projects by Yo Ding, Carol Liu, and Su Wei. And then chapter 4, I look more particularly at subject and agency, and look at the work of, as this loads, Zhang Huan, He Chengyao, and Cao Fei, where sort of develop different modes of cognition to really think through a kind of a narrative outside of resistance and agency. And then chapter 5 and the afterward are trying to kind of expand the method of Minor China, where I look at the work of Isaac Julien's work to think about the cinematic and theatrical Chinese woman. So thinking about different modes of objecthood. And here I'm looking at his work, 10,000 Ways, which looks at multiple moments in across Chinese history. I really love the cover of my book, but I was also really hoping to have Maggie Chung on the cover of my book. And so this was like another dream cover, although the cover I got is also a really lovely dream to have encapsulated. But this is sort of some of the images from his work. And then I read from the afterword, and just to give you a sense of the object, it's a work by Samson Young from Venice in 2017, from the Venice Biennale. So I think I'll just stop there, and hopefully that gives you a sense of the larger archive, and then also the broader stakes of the book. And I look forward to Professor Chu's comments.
Right, thank you. Thank you, Hentyle, for the great overview of the book, and also the introduction for theoretical framework, and also for showing these amazing artwork. I believe we will have more time to talk about it in Q&A. But now, firstly, I will turn over to Kandice.
Thank you. Hentyle, that was really wonderful. And it was really wonderful to the way in which you were able to lay it out for us in relation to that artwork. I kind of wish that there was an interactive version of the book that you could, I don't know, that's going to be the next iteration, next edition, perhaps. Let me begin by thanking Li-Ping Chen, Grace Ryu, Alex Eloriaga, Caitlin Lam, and the USC East Asian Studies Center generally for hosting this event organized around Hentyle Yapp's terrific and terrifically engaging book. I'm delighted and honored to be a part of this occasion. The extraordinary timeliness of Hentyle's project is of course intensified by the immense traffic and discourse about China accompanying the Winter Olympics underway right now in Beijing. That discourse focuses largely on the recent surge of Chinese state efforts to forcibly assimilate Uyghur Muslim peoples, efforts that the US has described as egregious human rights abuses and atrocities in the course of mounting its diplomatic boycott of the Olympic Games. And it resonates with and restages the long-lived moral high ground the US has staked in identifying China with such human rights violations. Minor China is very much interested in critiquing precisely the liberal framework through which China is cast as the delinquent member of a global community of nations in contemporary discourse. Hentyle compellingly lays out how such rhetoric informs the production of what he refers to as the major and proper China. That is, the China of the liberal imagination that characterizes dominant global geopolitics, as well as, he shows us, academic discourse and the global art market. The invitation and challenge Hentyle accordingly issues in the book is to consider both the grounds upon which proper major China emerges as a potent geopolitical and cultural construct, and the occlusions affected by such a construct. Minor China, as Hentyle was just explaining, names a method elaborated and employed in this book, and is also its thematic argument. A method derived from an eclectic range, from engagement with an eclectic range of critics and theorists, including Adorno, Glissant, Nancy, Lord, Deleuze and Guattari, and artists and performers, including Ai Weiwei, Zhang Huan, Cao Fei, He Chengyao, I can't read my own screen, and Isaac Julien. Minor China refuses the knowability and certainty that accompanies proper China. Instead, it operates variously through fabulation, hesitation, and lingering, through little movements and curation and elliptical approaches that provide insight into and or illuminate the inadequacy and narrowness of proper China as a designation for the infinite heterogeneity of people and place it putatively intends to delineate. Minor China as method affords acknowledgement of the evacuation of difference necessary to the assimilationist trajectories and inclusionary aims of globalizing liberalism, and creates and holds space for difference to emerge. By deriving and using Minor China as method, Hentyle elegantly shows how it is possible to reckon with both the inadequacy and damage of liberal understandings of freedom forcibly imposed by the hard and soft power of military and economic might by such entities as the United States, as well as the damage inflicted by the Chinese state in the course of upholding its own version and vision of itself as a major player on the global stage. This book, and quite rightly, I believe, argues the exigent need to bracket deliberately what popular and exhibition cultures and practices, as well as hegemonic political discourse, would have us believe about China, and to ask after the, quote, epistemological assumptions and ontological conditions that uphold the order of things, the major, to quote from the book. As we move through its chapters, Minor China lucidly shows us how doing so So sorry, my screen has gone completely crazy. Okay, hold on just a second. And I am so sorry.
Oh, no worries.
Okay, I'm going
There's
to try to
time.
close this and reopen it and see if that will work. That has never happened before. Okay, here we go. Okay, back where it was. By deriving and using Minor China's method, Hentyle elegantly shows how it is possible to reckon with both the inadequacy and damage of liberal understandings of freedom forcibly imposed by the hard and soft power of military and economic might by such entities as the United States, as well as the damage inflicted by the Chinese state in the course of upholding its own version and vision of itself as a major player on the global stage. This book, and quite rightly, I believe, argues the exigent need to bracket deliberately what popular and exhibition cultures and practices, as well as hegemonic political discourse, would have us believe about China, and to ask after the epistemological assumptions and ontological conditions that uphold the order of things, the major, to quote from the book. As we move through its chapters, Minor China lucidly shows us how doing so affords the address and redress of liberalism emerging from the art and curation practices anchoring the project, and regularly through the idiom and principles of Marxism. A focus on Marx's formulation of structural change and redistribution, Hentyle submits, enables us to recognize critically the intimacy of liberalism and capitalism as they organize the global art market, a key site through which Major China is produced, commodified, and circulated. Moreover, such a focus is expressed through the project's attention to social structuration in lieu of individual agency, and indeed to a subjective ontology rooted in the plurality of being. Thus it is that Minor China as method involves everything from ontology and epistemology to global capitalism and aesthetics. It is in this regard a salient reminder that China taken as an analytic category and point of entry is an opening to world writ large, or in Hentyle's Marxist idiom, it is an opening to totality. In the course of elaborating and demonstrating this method, Hentyle covers an enormous range of art, history, and ideas. I've not even touched on this book's interest in affect or its keen attention to exhibition and curation histories and practices, or its address of aesthetics and politics as key terms of philosophy and critical theory, or how it works with time, or the artworks with which it is concerned, for example. However, so that my remarks do something more than simply rehearse my admiration for the expansiveness of Hentai's critical vision, I want to turn to identifying just a few ideas he offered on which we might collectively linger in the manner Minor China explicitly invites. I note that in turning in this direction, I'm pulling forward what I think of as the pedagogical dimensions of the approaches and arguments comprising the book. I mean pedagogical here to refer to how our critical senses are directed and attuned, and how we learn and unlearn not only through what is given to us formally or properly, as Hentai might suggest, but also associatively and unintentionally, that is, by tracing resonances across works. I mean it also to refer to how in the academy our intellectual lives take shape and are practiced in the form of curricula and syllabi and critical protocols that are the textured stuff of field formations. Minor China, in its interest in the affordances and occlusions of academic discourse and its or our unintentional and overt embrace of major proper China, invites us to think pedagogically, to ask after how Minor China might reshape our practices and arrangements of knowledge. Toward these ends, I'll invite us to linger with Hentai's book in two arenas, and around which I'll pose a couple of questions for a collective consideration. The first of this is to stay with method. I want more explicitly to situate Hentai's articulation of Minor China as method in relation to Li-Ping Chen's Asia as method, which he cites, as well as Laura Kang's recent theorization, also following Chen, of Asian women as method in her book, Traffic in Asian Women. Published a little more than a decade ago, Chen's project argues the need and the difficulty, both the need and the difficulty of centering Asia, even in Asian cultural studies, given the embeddedness and indebtedness of that discourse in the hierarchizing epistemologies of the Cold War era. The shift, Chen argues, from taking Asia as a known and knowable entity to insisting that it be treated as a means by which knowledge is produced, a method, intends and attempts to de-Cold War knowledge, which he submits is necessary to advance de-imperialization. Hentai's work resonates vibrantly with Chen's efforts, as it likewise insists that what appears known and knowable as China tells us more about the onto-epistemologies of liberalism and capitalism than it does about people or entities or really anything in the area referred to as China itself. There are line projects of taking a cultural studies approach, which is to say, of investigating and illuminating the material conditions of production and circulation of ideas and aesthetics that constitutes the cultural terrain, reminds us that the stakes in attending to art and aesthetics are related to the redistribution of resources. Laura Kang's project unfurls this methodological interest in different direction, demonstrating that the stakes in carefully considering the category of Asian women are related to the emergence of hegemonic global political governance in the 20th century. Like Hentai, Kang compels us to recognize the potency of liberal frameworks through which racialized subjects are rendered legible, as victims and survivors, as violators of human rights, and as the violated. Detailing manifold ways that Asian women as a category became intelligible through particular modes of documentation of injury and violability across the historical record of geopolitics throughout the 20th century, Kang's project is to elucidate how the category obscures real people and real relations and operates on the terrain of the politics of recognition and representation. By situating Hentai's book in relation to Chen's and Kang's, I'm inviting us to consider the thematization of method itself, specifically in relation to the study of Asia. How may we understand the emergence and appeal and perhaps exigency of thinking methodologically about Asia in the 21st century? What does the centering of method do to the ways we conceive of something called Asian studies or Asian American studies? Why, in other words, does it continue to be necessary to insist on the fictionality and constructedness of national and ethno-racial categories like China, and continue to argue the limitations as well as damage of incorporation, assimilation, representation, and recognition as strategies of liberation? And perhaps more pointedly, how might Asian studies organize itself to interrupt the stronghold of proper understandings of China and other references to Asia more broadly? We might, in engaging these questions, linger with the presence of Isaac Julian's work in Hentai's book, and consider in the course of doing so the mobilization of the figure of the Chinese woman in that work, to ask how and why is a construct and figure available and recruitable to the work of interrupting the embrace of major proper China. And this is part of Hentai's work with that figure in that chapter. What if, as arguably for Julian, the Chinese woman is taken as a method central to the formation of the field of Asian studies? This is also to observe that percolating in Hentai's book is a quiet argument for the centrality of gender and sexuality to the study of China and to the study of the ways we study China. What might come of bringing that argument to the fore, of insisting that the hermeneutics of China be formulated around gender and sexuality? The other aspect of Hentai's work I'll pull forward this evening, or this afternoon for you, is his attention to lexicon. One of the many things I appreciate about Hentai's work is its careful attention to the common terms of politically engaged criticism, notably resistance, subjectivity, agency, and history among them, and his elucidation of how they can occlude rather than enlighten because of the assumptions they carried forward, assumptions organized by liberalist models of politics and knowledge. Along these lines, I wonder if we might not compile the critical lexicon that emerges through Minor China, that activates and moves the method of Minor China as a means of working in difference to the major and proper modes of knowing. Such a lexicon would surely include hesitation, mediation, fabulation, lingering, errancy, and elliptical orientations, as well as becoming, comrade aesthetics, and little movements. This book brought to mind for me along these lines Eve Sedgwick's theorization of nonce taxonomies, referring to the quotidian ways that queerness operates through invented categories, ones that exceed binary classifications. Nonce taxonomies are not intended to last. Rather, they refer to terms and forms that serve specific purposes, that name an activity or a desire, a way of being or a doing, that cannot be captured by or made into the proper. Always inappropriate, they are also inappropriatable. Following this line of thought, we might linger with Hentai's emphasis on the proper to think its related valences, propriety and appropriateness, as well as property and prop. Not only in relation to China, but generally as a practice of knowledge, how can the practice of Minor China as method help us remain inappropriate and inappropriated, to borrow a phrase from Trin Minh Ha? The point, of course, is not impropriety for its own sake, but because we know that out-of-placeness and wrongness index normativity is constituted by relations of materializing power. We know also that those relations of power take shape as private property within the current dominant order of things. What can the improper, the minor, do to help us delegitimize property and possession as aspirations and ideals? The lexicon of improper Minor China Hentai brings forward provides us with what we might call a poetics of Sinophone studies, a pedagogy through which we unlearn what we know and learn to sense difference. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kandice, for this very insightful feedback and comment. And then while we are waiting for audience to submit their questions, I was wondering whether Hentyle, you want to respond or maybe share some thoughts in relation to Kandice's comments.
Yeah, thank you. No, that was, I'm very honored, and I really am very touched to have someone like you, who I so greatly respect, and is like a huge part of the book, and weaves in and out. I really am grateful and very thankful for you taking the time to engage in this way and in such deep terms. I think in terms of, it's funny because you start with the Winter Olympics, and those have been on my mind. And what I've just been yelling at my phone when I'm reading the New York Times, because it is just illustrating everything that I'm just so frustrated by, right? So it first began with calling it the Genocide Olympics, but I was like, but we've never called the Olympics in the United States that anytime it's been held here, but yet it is the Genocide Olympics. But for some reason, we can't, American exceptionalism doesn't allow us to actually think about, right, the United States as the site. But then, there's two frames, right? I don't want to default into a kind of international relations discourse where it's like I'm trying to figure out, who's the better statehood or not. I also don't want to, I'm a student of Iowa Ong. I don't want to necessarily think about China becoming more American, more US. Like I don't want to think about, neoliberalism as the kind of form in which all non-Western nation states let's follow, right? I know those debates have been kind of done or, have been established and are really critical reminders. But what I've been thinking about with the example is the nation state is the problem, right? The problem isn't just China's better or the US, whatever discourse you want to fall into, but it's the fact that the nation state is actually the figure of issue, and that I would rather put pressure on the nation state as a kind of form. And, the other kind of like key part of that equation is that, that discourse has been rumbling, and then suddenly it's like the Uyghur athlete is the one that lights the torch. And I was like, and people were like, is it genuine? And I was just like, how many US corporations have Black Lives Matters? T-shirts and imprints and posters on their walls, when they clearly are not structured to actually think about anti-Blackness, and let alone how often does the US put a minoritarian person up, right, as a representational politic without actually restructuring? That is late liberalism. That's what we've been calling it, right? But yet we can't even name that when we talk about China, right? It's as if it's this kind of simplistic modality. So I guess I'm kind of returning to where you began, to maybe it made me think a lot more about method, right? And the need for method, because in some ways it's not just about like the book isn't really about China. Like it is about China, but it's using China as the method to actually rethink the very foundations of knowledge. And that I think what's so critical in your work and many, essentially Asian American literary feminism, like that entire vein, is that it's not just a simplistic rejection of liberalism. It's that we cannot, it is the thing we cannot afford to let go of. It is the thing that is both the problem and the way in which we sort of think with and through things, and that there's no outside of that sort of formulation. And that's something that I take so dearly as a basis in which I write and think, which I think is the basis of kind of method of to think about that and naming that as a kind of methodology. Because one of the questions I received from Doreen Kondo at USC, who's a trained anthropologist, was like, I have such an aversion to method and have because of like the training, and which I don't disagree with. But it is fascinating, like when you think about people writing about, decolonial methods and all, this kind of turn to method, is that it's not this sort of simplistic return to kind of scientism or validity, but it's trying to sort of name a certain modality of thinking about China, which I think is really about thinking about Asia. And especially when we're talking about the contemporary, really trying to use method to think about racial capital in Asia, because I akin to a lot of your work, like if we just go back to cycles of accumulation, right? We're leaving the American century and entering the Asian century. And yes, it's fueled by China, but it's also fueled by South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, many other spaces. So there's something really important about staying with method, not just for naming the kind of problematics of liberalist impulses. So go back to the Olympics discourse, but also I think thinking about the contemporary and what method does for us to thinking about the problematic of racial capital in the Asian century. And that's kind of that's really where I'm kind of headed now and thinking through that sort of question. And I know it's much related to your work as well. But, so I'm glad you kind of noted that, because that's just something I've been thinking about. What is it about thinking about methodologically with Asia, not just China, but really Asia itself? And the fact that it's, if you go back to Giovanni Arrighi's work, he names the Dutch cycle, he names nation states, but it's Asia as a kind of cluster, as a, including India, right? That becomes this kind of fascinating driver of racial capital today. And I think method for me is the way that I've been trying to handle that question. So I don't know how that resonates with you, because I know that's something that you're also sort of related things that you're also thinking with and through.
No, for sure. I mean, one of the things that I love so much about the work that you've done here, Hentyle, and thank you for the generous comments, we're just interlocutors, right? We're not, we're just inside of each other's work, I think, is that it activates the idea of practice in some way, right? So there is a kind of like method always means that it isn't for its own sake. It is a doing, and it's always a figuring out like what is a method, what is this method for, right? Toward what ends, and it activates all of the kind of relations, right? Like who is enacting upon what basis, with what tools, with what apparatus, toward what ends, and I do think that there is something that's really. It is striking to me that it seems so vital, and I genuinely believe that it's so vital a way that we are now for us to be approaching the idea of Asia, right? To actually be studying the idea of Asia. Now, I would say that's probably always been true. And that, this is just kind of the formulation that has been emerging right now. And so that's something sort of, I'm curious as to why in some way, right? In the sort of like Raymond Williams, why is this a key word that's emerging right now, right? Like what are the kind of debates that are allowing it to emerge? And there is something to me about, there's a part in the book where you kind of name the problem of scale, right? So yeah, nation state, exclusionary nationalism, the particular form, the modern colonial form of the nation state is a problem. We have to keep continuing to work that. But there's also a moment where you're naming the problem of scale in relation to China. We talk about like the kind of, expanse of territory, the numbers of people, the sort of the dimensions of what we're trying to squeeze under this rubric of China is not the same as something like the United States, which is also deeply heterogeneous. I'm not trying to, kind of evacuate that, but it seems more so in the case of China, right? The idea of China, because it's just massive, So the project of trying to create a sense of unified national identity, right? It quite literally has to scale up. And so there's something that comes to mind of, Neil Smith's work with scale, right? Where scale is not just a problem of quantity, but also quality, right? So what is the quality of the nation state? Yeah, like that scale as a quality, right? To what extent does the idea of method, right? If we take minor China as method, how do we actually get to the problem of nation state as a problem of scale? Yeah, that we're trying to fit these entities into the same formal box that actually, even if that were the solution, it's never going to work, right? It just cannot work and cannot exist and be governed in that same way. But one of the things that comes to mind is, and I feel this all the time in the kind of my appreciation of literary arts or, kind of visual arts, et cetera. The figures and the artists with whom you're working, right? They are exhibiting in biennials or exhibiting in major places, major institutions, and they are aestheticizing, making available, illuminating, elaborating minor China, right? So how do we activate what the kind of work that they are doing and the sort of method that you are drawing, you are articulating out of it in a broader scale, right? Which is to say, it isn't that it's not happening, it's that the happening isn't intervening in the representation of the Olympics right now in the ways in which we would want, right? So how do we actually narrow that gap? And that's, if you have the solution, great. but I think that's actually part of the problem, right? Is of area studies or Asian American studies, all of those kinds of formations, we're trying to actually produce a relationship between the ways that we are thinking and practicing and analyzing, right, theorizing, and what is happening out there. And I don't know, I just don't know where we find that traction, right? Where we find the stickiness to make that kind of transformation happen.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, like I appreciate you naming that, because, one starting point of this book was seeing, Yenqing's work, which is the cover of the book, and I just saw it at a random curated show, and I sat with it for probably an hour. It's only like a 7-minute loop piece, right? I was just like, what on earth is this? And then it was so minor and simple and formal. And I was, and this was like sort of presented and next to, and in a show presenting Li Yao, which so right here, which was like an obvious piece about this artist going into an Apple factory at Foxconn, working there and leaving with the iPad. Like that was sort of in the rounds of, the internet sort of discourse and news and such at that time. And it was just fascinating to see those two pieces rendered there, because one was quite legible and immediate for consumption. One was completely just sort of like, what is happening here? And when I talked to Yinqing, and when I also spoke with Cao Fei, who connected me to him, I just, I kind of just asked cheekily, it's like do you consider yourself political? Just like as just to test the waters. And most of them said no, or they said they had such a nuanced answer, which was like, I know the art market considers me such, but the work does so much more. And I didn't want to just dismiss that as a kind of simplistic sort of romance narrative of the artist, but actually as a generating force to think about the complexity of the work and what it's doing and the theoretical import of that work, while also having a kind of political commitment to it. And so I wanted to, so when we think about like, how do we expand that like idea, like part of it is sure the discourse, the public discourse, the media discourse, but like, we're in the university, we train future X, right? We train future thinkers in the world. And it's not just about thinkers who are doing graduate school. It's also about people who do undergraduate degrees and then go into media work, who go into public work. And it's about producing a kind of training that isn't solely about, learning about Asia so that one can then enter Asia to be a better capitalist and learn the special ways, which is to actually say, the fact that we can say the idea of Asia is actually quite different from my understanding historically of area studies and Asian studies itself. Like, we're not talking about, let's learn more, let's go to the Asian Studies Conference and then only go to the China panels, or, now there's such a push to actually think about global Asias, to actually think about this, which is to say the idea of Asia is actually gaining such a big currency now, and it's taken some time to get there. But even the field itself is shifting in that sort of frame, which I see indicated by the idea of global Asias. So I think that there's no silver bullet here, but there's a way in which we train and talk about this that needs to get outside of the ossified area studies model, which isn't to discount it. Like that's the difficulty of naming that. It's like there's also many people who are not just doing that kind of work. So I want to kind of like bring that through the idea of method, which allows us to name the idea of Asia, right? So the fact that we can even say that and have it be legible or kind of like a common discourse is actually, I think, a really great sign of kind of shifts around fields itself and questions of training, which you were bringing up when you were talking about the field of Asian studies.
There's something that you said, and I know that we're going to move to kind of opening up to Q&A for a minute, but one of the other kind of threads that I thought to pull forward and I just didn't have an opportunity really to formulate it into my comments is actually your attention to time in this book, and your attention to the artist's attention to time. So duration. I mean, you talked a little about it in walking us through the Ai Weiwei piece. Yeah. Dropping your in the Ai Weiwei piece and the kind of frozen time, but really that sense of the importance of hesitation and lingering and kind of pause, right? And the emphasis on duration. And even in your narrative, like something made you stop and look, something made you stop and stay with that 7-minute loop, right? And it is a kind of, I don't know, open curiosity for me. How do we elicit those subjects into being, right? How do we elicit the person who's actually who doesn't want to move through to then be able to check off the box to say, I went and saw that exhibit, right? But who's actually willing to sit. And that feels like a kind of temporal mode that is related to the minor China. Yeah. And I don't know how you would teach that, but that seems worthwhile.
Yeah. Well, I think part of that is like, like when, like I love my students, right? And they want to be such good, perfect subjects of this world, right? And so they can recount in a second, like they look at something and they can tell you exactly what's wrong with it, right? And even to a point to where I have to stop them sometimes, right? And just say like, but don't you just love this use of light? Just can we talk about that? And then I try to build from there to then think about what those formal details allow us to think in a larger political discourse or political theory, like to do that kind of work. But I always find it like an instantaneous move to be like, when you see a minoritarian artist, like they're good, they're resisting, and therefore they show how wrong power is. And I was like, yes, but let's sit, like what else with the work? Or else they have the other thing where I'll show like an art market star, like I'll show work by Arthur Jaffa or by people who've really made it big in the art world as examples pedagogically. And then they'll be like, oh yeah, it's fine, it's good, whatever. But they're part of capitalism because they're in the art world. And then I kind of tell them, there's no perfect subject. And if you try to live up to that standard, either you're extremely rich with the trust fund to where you can be a perfect subject in outside capital, although that's questionable, or you actually have to, like, what can we do to actually have a more capacious work and relationship to it, which isn't to excuse politics or take it out, but actually to have a much more complicated frame with the political. And so that's just something that and part of that is that pause, like part of that is the willingness to give each other space to actually think capaciously and to pause in that. So I do really try to do that at the level of pedagogy in the classroom, just because students are so fast and good at like the critique, right? And then I want to sort of have that, encapsulate that through the minorist method in some ways as a way to kind of hesitate, like through Lisa Lowe's work in building on hesitation as a kind of method to not just repeat like therefore agency, therefore resistance, but actually allow us to like unpack when we say agency, when we say the state, when we say power, what are our assumptions even in those terms? And even Asia, when we say Asia, right, to even question the idea of Asia, I think is doing part of that work.
Yeah, so this is a great conversation, and so I believe this now is a great time for our audience to also share their feedback and questions. So we have a question from Sean. Hi, Sean. And this question is actually related to what we just discussed. It's about time. It's about temporality. So let me read this question for you. Can you elaborate the temporality of minor China as method? That is, within the frame of global capitalism or within the frame of Taiwan with its re-emergent discourse of indigeneity. It seems that minor requires calibration to notions of various majors or hegemonies. How does minor China reveal the texture of these different timeframes that erupt into one another?
So thanks for that question. It's funny, I'm trying to think about it, maybe because Kandice, you're right here, but in thinking about your book, The Difference Aesthetics Makes, when you build out a kind of genealogy of illiberal humanisms and you rely on, let's say, like Jody Bird's work, I'm thinking through the idea of temporality, in which there's a kind of, in terms of the way that you're sort of framing Jody Bird's work and through the work, there's a way in which the pastness temporality of dispossession of indigenous genocide is kind of remembered and then displaces contemporary advocacy and demands for land back movement or anything that actually restructures. And perhaps this goes to your second question, Kandice, around like property, like to actually think about shifting contemporary forms of property relations in the contemporary to restructure and redistribute in a way. So are the temporality of minor China's method that resonates with the idea of illiberal humanisms that you're drawing from, in which part of it's building from Jody Bird's work in critical indigenous studies, is thinking about both the temporality and history of pastness but also how that allows us to restructure in the contemporary and to redistribute in ways that have a kind of what I'm calling a minor, not just a minor for minor's sake, but a minor towards minoritarian ends, which is really about restructuring. So really not just perpetuating late liberal impulses to represent without restructuring, but actually doing the representational work that also involves a radical restructuring of how institutions are, sort of exist. So I think that's part of, in thinking about the temporality of the kind of method, which is in some ways it's a method of remembrance of history, while also not just using that as the only way in which we produce the identity of subjects, but using that towards modes and methods for restructuring and redistributing that change the conditions of today, that allow us to reimagine a future and restructure in certain ways. So that's definitely a part of some of that temporality. If that helps answer that question.
I think the other part, actually, I mean, I understand the way that you formulated Minor China also to be insisting that at any moment, or really just to, how to put this, to always be thinking about time as a condition of possibility. So, this is a Marxian concept also, right? But so that we cannot, Minor China as method is constantly reminding us that even the dimension of time itself is something that is recruited for various ends. And for that reason, Sean, exactly as embedded in your question, right? There must always be a way of asking the question about what is the temporality of the major that is being imposed upon and occluding or decimating or evacuating the minor, right? Evacuating other modes of relationship that are organized by time, right? So, Minor China reveals the textures of different time frames precisely by insisting that we attend to time frames itself, right? Like time as a framework that is narrowing and an affordance, right? That actually, liberal developmental discourses or the civilizational discourses of colonialism are discourses of time, right? The angel of history is a discourse of time. And so what Isaac Julian is doing with that figure, right? And employing Maggie Chung there. And in your reading of that, right, of really insisting that actually she is not somebody who is removed, that figure is not someone, not removed from people on the ground, but is actually a part of that scene, right? That's a reorganization of time as much as it is a reorganization of our understanding of history. So, I think that there are ways that Sean answered the question that he asked.
Thanks, Candice. That was like a great rendition.
That was a great.
Yeah, really well.
I mean,
Yeah.
I think like Sean's book, right, also appears in your book, and I think that there's a really wonderful conversation that happens between Seascape of, the kind of Chinese Atlantic and what you were doing.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Which is a similar kind of methodological approach to that in terms of thinking about Seascape as a method. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so now we are talking about temporality, we're talking about time frame. We are now moving on to actually one of the participants zooming from another time zone that's in Taiwan, Taipei. So we have one question from Yating Lin from Taipei National University of the Arts from School of Dance. And specifically, they want to know whether there are sections in this book that discuss issues about or of dance, and then or how does the Minor China as a method can be further engaged in terms of dance studies and also corporeality in your research, and also they're interested in your own experience as a dancer as well.
Okay. So I worked with Wudao Hongjian, so dance form in Taipei. So I danced with them for a few years. That answers that question. And I was there when Yang Minglong, who used to dance with Trisha Brown and just for a while. So that's kind of my company experience, particularly in Taipei. And then I moved to New York after that. So in terms of dance studies, it's a field that I initially was planning on going into when I first started my graduate work. And because of my own sort of artistic background, but also felt that a lot of the conversation or the kind of the work that I was doing was also interested in expanding the different archives towards performance art and visual art. So I didn't focus solely on sort of dance works, but for me, the minors method is actually really quite informed by my own training as a dancer, which is to say, like, the pause, the hesitation, isn't just a moment to just stop, but it's actually, you know, as dancers know, you can never stop movement even when you're standing still, right? You're like the way in which your toes have to really kind of be firmly in the ground, and the kind of even just the wiggle of like the ankle bones, like those are actual little movements to build off of some of the curatorial work that I'm working with in the book. Those are all things that are so deeply embedded in the methodology that I'm kind of thinking through. And so the minors method is definitely much actually indebted to my own life as a in dance. But the archive is not necessarily explicitly so, but the analytics certainly are in terms of the book and what I'm working with.
All right. Thank you, Hentyle. And we have one question actually submitted earlier during the registration process. And this question specifically want to know how you start this project, especially about, how you, started and then, formulate and conceptualize this methodology, Minor China. So basically, in a word, how does everything got started?
Oh, gosh.
It's a very difficult question.
I mean, in some ways, biographically, after I left dance, I went to law school, and it was like one of the worst mistakes and best things that I ever did in my life, which was to say, this was the moment around 9/11 when it was happening, and I was working as an artist, and I was like, why bother? Or like, what's the import of being an artist? So I thought going to law school would be the answer, meaning I abandoned the aesthetic for a very explicit idea of the political, to be very quite frank. And I thought that would be the answer. But then you realize when you go through legal training, and especially when you're at a program that does critical race theory, that you realize the law is actually not the answer, but the problem. And while I was there, this is around the time when terrorist assemblages came out, and I was introduced to Saidiya Hartman's Scenes of Subjection years earlier, and I kept reading those books while going into law school classes. And I realized, wow, I can actually think differently. Like, there's a whole other genealogy of thought that I'm obsessed with, but didn't really understand what I could do with it. But it was also giving me the tools to be critical within a legal setting, which is to question, what are your ideas of justice? What does a fight for further inclusion and rights actually get us at the end of the day? And that became a moment to actually question the political. So I ended up doing a PhD where I finally felt like I actually think about the political and aesthetics by actually unpacking all the terms, which is to say, I was already in my mind, without knowing it, developing the minors method, which is to say, unpacking the very fundamental bases of both the aesthetic and the political. So in some ways, I'm probably giving the long-winded answer, but that's kind of where the kind of impulse and drive for trying to write this book was trying to kind of get at, which is to kind of illustrate a way to not just default into the very terms we hold dear, but analyze and understand the very assumptions, epistemological foundations, and ontological conditions that allow those terms, like the subject, like the very basic things, to actually emerge. Or, as Kandice was answering for me, like a frame like temporality. Like, well, how does kind of the normative liberal impulse towards a kind of progressive stance always get us to? So in some ways, the minors method in some ways is like I was writing it for myself to actually answer some of these long lingering questions that brought me into academia in the first place. And then China became such an amazing space to actually think that, precisely because the idea of China is always so major. And so to think with and through the kind of growing work in minor theories around affect theory, new materialisms, et cetera, but using that as a kind of methodology to pause and hesitate, to actually allow us to rupture and allow us to pause and think about the idea of China historically and in the contemporary sense, was sort of what brought me to sort of consolidate that. But I think the kind of very basic drive was trying to answer lingering questions around like why I felt a certain formal work was actually really quite political. Like I would see really beautiful work that was formally innovated and I knew it was political, but I didn't have the language to talk about that. And so in some ways, this book is kind of answering that baseline question. And then, then China allows me to kind of illustrate and really think through that a little bit more. So that's probably much long-winded question, but hopefully it gives you a sense of kind of the honest genesis of thinking through this idea.
Thank you for sharing, especially your worst but best decision as well for the law school experience. So moving on, so we have some more questions in the Q&A box, and there's one question about the different artworks that you analyze in the book, and it's specific about the different genres. So let me read this question. Can you talk more about the connections between the different genres that you choose to include in your book? The book seems to have a wonderful representation of a variety of artistic genres. How did you pick and choose these genres? And what are the underlying connections, aesthetically, culturally, and socially, do these genres share?
I think part of working in performance studies is being unwieldy and perhaps non-fully methodological or properly methodological when curating objects. But part of what resonated with me in terms of the different genres, from performance art to visual art to some sonic work, is that they ultimately allow me, and in the book I sort of develop it, to really understand a larger rubric of mediation as opposed to genre specificity. So what I mean by that is that the book is really trying to think about how different objects are trying to mediate in different ways. So how photography mediates temporality in different ways as opposed to performance, how performance mediates certain ideas of the political as opposed to film. So there's the kind of genres, it's a mixed media genre book in order to allow me to get to questions of mediation, which is about the different forms and what they allow us to mediate and sort of think through. So that I think is fundamentally what is sort of undergirding the curation of objects in the book, is that it allowed me to get out of genre specificity and like only write a book on performance or only write a book on visual art, but actually allow us different modes of mediation. And that's something I sort of develop in the introduction and throughout the book a bit. I wanted to actually title the book Minor China Method, Materialisms, Mediation and the Aesthetic, but it was like a mouthful. So mediation ended up losing in the desire for a trifecta of words.
Maybe for next book.
Maybe.
Yeah. So we are quickly approaching toward the end, but there's one question that I think is very interesting because we are now talking about, in academic work, but the one question is about classroom pedagogical practices. So let me read this question from Wellington. Thank you, Hentyle, and then fellow Brian from UCLA for the Berkeley, for the wonderfully communicative presentation. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how you translate the methodology of Minor China to pedagogical practice? Or how did you perceive the challenge of this translation?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what I think Kandice and I were talking about earlier is kind of that pause or that hesitation. In which you ask students to kind of look at the object, think about form and not rush into critique and not just stop critique or say it's apolitical, but start from the minor and allow us to sort of build a larger political critique from that. So that's part of that. But I think another part of Minor China as a practice in the minors method is also thinking about diversity in the classroom, to be quite frank. Part of what I find really important is to bring in, I do the representational project, right? I think about those who have not been read, right? And for many different reasons. And I also try to not just bring in voices because they haven't been read, but for kind of the import in which they bring. But in doing so, I also want to caution from solely doing a kind of representational politic to where it's a simply kind of bringing in folks to represent a perspective, where you suddenly have like the Asian American Feminist Week, or then you have the Disability Week. But Minor China and the minors methods fundamentally asking us, what do these different vantage points allow us to do to restructure the ways we interact, right? So if I'm doing a disability week, it isn't just like, let me show you disabled artists from China or disabled artists, period, but how do they help us question notions of temporality, of normative cognitive functioning, which isn't just about questioning like one's own apparatus, but also how I run the classroom. Right? What expectations do I have of students around, normative student participation? So this is something that I've had to sort of restructure my own practice and pedagogy, is that, we normally think of a good student as like those who come to the classroom, they're staring right at you and they're listening the whole time, right? Like that means good participation. You know what? A lot of students need to doodle. A lot of students don't want to make eye contact, right? In the Zoom era, a lot of students want to turn off the camera. It doesn't mean they're not attentive, right? There are class issues, there are access issues, there are many things that go on with even our expectation around participation. So even the minors method for me has been a call to not just think about this as a kind of a call to simply do a kind of representational inclusion project, but actually restructure how I run the classroom, my assumptions of what a student is, and how we can actually do that type of political work through a restructuring process under the confines of the university and institution, right? So that's something that hopefully gives you a sense of both Minor China, like when Kandice and I were speaking about earlier, around ideas of hesitation and pause and sitting with things. But I think content-wise, I also find it important to not just include different perspectives, but to do that at the service of restructuring and our kind of intellectual projects and our political projects.
All right, thank you, Hentyle. And then I believe this might be our last question. And then to wrap up the event for today, and this question is from Shenjiang, specifically about how you situate your work in conversation with other fields. For example, today our event is Sinophone studies. So let me read the question. How would you situate your work in relation to the existing scholarship on Sinophone studies, whose main interest has been also thinking of China otherwise?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, the other book that that kind of opened me up to thinking about, critical theory and especially around questions of China was Visuality and Identity by Xu Shi. So that book radicalized everything the way that I could think, especially because I majored in French literature and Francophone was like such a concept, and Sinophone completely just like opened up a huge aperture for me. So this work, I think, isn't necessarily explicitly in Sinophone studies, right? The Sinophone, like, I think there's such a huge, beautiful turn that's happening there. And I think part of, in thinking about mediation and performance art in different objects, I'm also trying to think about what other mediated objects do for us in addition to the literary, and that how those questions might also help us expand the field of Sinophone studies itself. But I can see my relationship to the field, but I'm not like the conversations I'm really thinking through and key questions aren't necessarily fully central to it. But certainly it's a field that really was a starting point to thinking expansively about the idea of Asia and to sort of think through a lot of these larger questions.
All right, thank you, Hentyle. And let me double check the time. All right, so before we wrap up the event for today, so we still have many questions in the chat box that unfortunately we don't have time to address, but we will collect them and then we will send them to Hentyle and Kandice, so the speakers will still know your feedback and also your reaction to today's talk and conversation. And let's see. So this event is recorded, and then we will share the recording link in the event webpage later this week, I believe. So feel free to share with your students or your colleague about today's amazing talk. So that said, what an awesome way to start the series for spring 2022. Thank you, Hentyle, for sharing your work with us. And also thank you, Kandice, for offering very insightful comments. I really enjoy the conversation and also to hear more about what you guys think about this book. And thank you, our audience, for being with us from different time zones and also all the great questions that you shared with us. So remember to check out our event webpage for other book talks in this series, but also many, many more upcoming events hosted by EASC. So again, thank you, our two amazing speakers today.
Thank you so much for all your work.
And then
Thank you, Hentyle.
Thank you, Hentyle. And then stay safe. And then we will see you in our next event. Take care.
Good night, everyone.
Bye. Good night.